Thank you very much for being here. This is the lecture for the annual lecture for the American Lectures in the History of Religion. My name is Rumi Ahmed. I'm an associate professor of Islamic law and associate dean at the University of British Columbia. And I want to tell you a little bit about our committee before we begin. The ALHR committee that includes Drs. Barbara Ambrose, Leela Prasad, Duncan Williams, and myself as chair is tasked with organizing a biannual lecture series that reflects on bodies of work and pressing issues in religious studies. And each lecture series is delivered by a single scholar in a single geographical region. This year's ALHR speaker is Dr. Jeffrey Stout of Princeton University, and he's going to be delivering a series of lectures this February titled The Cinematic Sacred at a number of universities in the Research Triangle area, namely, in alphabetical order, Duke, North Carolina State, UNC Chapel Hill, UNC Greensboro, and Wake Forest. More details about that will be on AAR's website. And we are also pleased to announce that the 2020 speaker this year will be, not this year, but in 2020, will be Dr. Daisy Machado of the Union Theological Seminary. And she's going to be delivering a series of lectures on the topic of borderlands in the Southern California area. And in addition to the lecture series, the ALHR also hosts an annual panel here at the AAR meeting. And each year we look for a topic that's of pressing interest to the AAR community of scholars, whether that's an issue within the Academy itself or something outside to which the Academy is compelled to respond. And last year our committee found the issue of identity politics in the Academy coming up again and again in panel QAs and online forums and in the plenary addresses, and we thought there was an appetite to have more in-depth discussion within and among our fields of inquiry. And a look at this year's program and the number of sessions on the topic suggests that that is indeed the case. So as a starting point for our conversation, we identified an article published just this year that has caused a great deal of conversation and debate. And that's namely Dr. Ayesha S. Chaudhry's article in the Oxford Handbook of Islamic Law titled Islamic Legal Studies, A Critical Historiography. Now, that title doesn't sound particularly groundbreaking. Thank you. It doesn't sound particularly groundbreaking or controversial, but within 2 weeks of its online publication, it was viewed over 1,000 times on academia.edu, and I don't have the exact numbers for those who viewed it on Oxford's site, but I'm told that it's substantial. The article has already been cited in scholarly works from Christian systematic theology to curriculum studies and education, and it has clearly struck a chord amongst some and a nerve amongst others, well beyond the confines of religious studies and certainly Islamic studies. And so the committee sought to facilitate a scholarly discussion about the issues raised in the article, using it as a point of departure to discuss the politics involved in the scholarly production of knowledge. We have a distinguished panel of scholars here from Christian, Hindu, Islamic, and Sikh studies with us here today, and having seen their papers ahead of time, I can say that they're going to be making somewhat regular reference to Dr. Chaudhry's article in their talks. So before introducing the speakers and starting the conversation, I would like to, with Dr. Chaudhry's permission, to give a brief synopsis of the paper, which can be viewed online at Oxford Handbooks Online or academia.edu. And I can tell you as one of the editors of the Oxford Handbook that publishing this article involved a lot of conversation, not only amongst the editors, but with OUP as well. And that's because the article is a historiography that has no footnotes. It does not reference any scholars of Islamic studies by name, and it is written in a first-person conversational style. And this was part of Dr. Chaudhry's argument in the article, namely that the standards of excellence that determine appropriate and worthy scholarship are themselves inextricably bound to multiple historical projects of domination over marginalized communities that must be resisted and subverted if scholarship hopes to be morally accountable. Reproducing those standards only perpetuates that domination, making scholarship irremediably complicit in the continued subjugation and disenfranchisement of already marginalized communities. This logic of domination and subjugation, Chaudhry argues, not only negatively impacts scholarship on marginalized communities, but those scholars who identify themselves with those communities, forcing them to transcend their identities even as they are delimited by them. And to demonstrate how this works, she walks us through two dominant trends that she sees in Islamic studies, one of which she calls white supremacist Islamic studies and the other patriarchal Islamic studies. And she discusses how these methods of study emerged out of contexts of domination and how they work individually and in tandem to promote standards of excellence and scholarly practices that perpetuate various colonial projects, in the process highlighting the interplay between neocolonialism, racism, and patriarchy with hierarchical academic structures. As a corrective, Chaudhry argues for an aspirational method of study, which she calls intersectional Islamic studies, that adheres to standards of excellence that privilege living communities, which, in practice, often means undermining and subverting the methods, practices, and standards of excellence to which we are used and in which we in the Academy have been trained. She does this in the article through a thorough and rather scathing critique of her own first book, which was widely celebrated in the Academy, but which she argues is a prime example of the kind of self-referential coloniality that enacts violence upon scholars and communities and which characterizes the Academy today. I think that's enough of a background to get us into the conversation, though of course there's much more to be said. And we'll have our panelists present their remarks individually, and then hopefully have a conversation amongst the panelists and open it up. Our first panelist today was scheduled to be Dr. Jo Krishnamoorthy, who received her PhD from York University and is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at St. Mary's University in Halifax. She takes her research and teaching take a critical race feminist approach to religion and representation in the South Asian diaspora, the Black diaspora, and in global culture. But climate change, so Dr. Krishnamoorthy has been delayed by snow in Halifax, but we are very fortunate to have with us today Dr. Harshita Moorthy Kamath here, who has agreed to read Dr. Krishnamoorthy's paper and to share her own thoughts. Dr. Kamath received her PhD from Emory University and is Visvesvara Rao and Sita Kopaka Assistant Professor of Telugu Culture, Literature, and History at Emory University's Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies. She is the author of Impersonations, The Artifice of Brahman Masculinity in Kuchipudi Dance, and co-authored the first English language translation of the 16th century Telugu text, Theft of a Tree, which will be part of the Moorthy Classical Library of India, published by Harvard University Press. Her research examines the intersections of gender, performance, and caste in contemporary South Asia. Dr. Kamath.
Okay. So Sylvia would like to express her gratitude to Dr. Ahmed and Dr. Chaudhry for the invitation to participate in this panel with these brilliant colleagues. I'm going to read, and there are moments that Sylvia wrote the paper as I, and I'm going to sub the word Sylvia every time she says I, but there are also moments that she says we, and I think that Sylvia and I would be on the same page in many of her comments, and we've actually discussed this paper in advance of her flight delays, so I kind of know where she's going with the argument. In her essay, Dr. Chaudhry makes a powerful argument for what she calls intersectional Islamic studies, or IIS, double IS, I don't know how you want to do it. There's lots of acronyms here. A framework and methodology that centers Muslim subjects, particularly those who are women and racialized, and is attentive to complex intersecting subjectivities. She also offers IIS as an alternative to the prevailing frameworks established by predominantly male scholars of Islam, WISIS, White Supremacist Scholarship of Islamic Studies, mostly white scholars, and PILS, Patriarchal Islamic Legal Studies, largely brown male scholars. IIS provides a space particularly for racialized Muslim women to speak, research, and theorize, and challenges assumptions about what constitutes objective academic work. Dr. Chaudhry's essay provides an elegant reading of the current state of Islamic studies in the academy, but critically, her essay also performs intersectional Islamic studies. By centering her voice and her experiences throughout, and by refusing to participate in the conventional citational politics of academic writing, Dr. Chaudhry shows us how another kind of intellectual self-exploration is possible. In this short piece, Sylvia attempts to continue this register as she reflects on the ways that we might take up intersectionality in the context of Hindu studies. Intersectional feminist work begins with a naming of our locations and relationships to our subjects. Sylvia, and I would include myself in this list, write as both insider and outsider. Sylvia identifies as Hindu, but she is not an authentic practitioner. She was born into an upper caste Hindu family in India, but was raised in the diaspora. She has experienced particular forms of racism and sexism as a cisgendered South Asian woman in North America and in Asia, and she has also had access to certain forms of privilege. And I would add that in my case, my caste identity as a Brahmin woman and my insider status allows me to have forms of access and privilege within the Brahmin communities that I work with in India. Sylvia works on and studies Hindu communities, identities, and representations, but she was not trained in religious studies. Her PhD is in social and political thought, South Asian studies, and feminist cultural theory. She thus has a unique perspective on the discipline as someone who kind of snuck into religious studies through the back door, as she says. She wants to share some thoughts from this vantage point, drawing also on conversations that she has had with other racialized scholars in the field. From across the disciplines, one thing that scholars of South Asian religions might mostly agree on is that Hindu studies as a field emerges from colonialism and the philological tradition, a history closely related to that outlined by Dr. Chaudhry. Contemporary scholars in Hindu studies are really good at talking about colonialism and its impacts on the intellectual development of the field and categories of understanding. But we have a much harder time talking about and naming its whiteness. White Orientalist scholars of Sanskrit devoted their lives to the study of antiquity and saw themselves as connected and yet superior to the Brahmins of India, who were its intellectual elites. In the present moment, the most prominent scholars in Hindu studies now are still white intellectuals who have specialized in Sanskrit and/or other South Asian languages. These are people whose translations we rely on. They are also mentors to many people in the field. They are journal and book series editors, they are on hiring committees, and they write reference letters. The young white scholars who are trained by them are made in their image. Like their mentors, they are skilled linguists, they spend time in fieldwork, they translate texts, they are in every way young masters over their field. We might think about this formation as analogous to what Dr. Chaudhry calls WISES. In fact, I'm going to call it, she titles it WISCs, White Supremacist Casteist Hindu Studies. White scholars who teach Sanskrit and translate pre-colonial texts are arguably the most powerful intellectual force in the field of Hindu studies. They define the field and define the tradition through this intellectual production. But white anthropologists and historians of religion who uncritically reproduce certain methods and perspectives fit here too. Universities in North America and Europe remain spaces of white supremacy, but the great majority of practitioners in the Hindu tradition everywhere are of South Asian heritage. It is not only white scholars who are complicit with WISCs. There are some scholars Sylvia would situate in this group who are of South Asian descent, and many of them are upper caste and mostly Brahmin. She would place them in this category not because they are white, but because they remain invested in the power structures of white supremacist Hindu studies. In the same way that upper caste Hindus have historically been invested in systems of power, but also now in a way that is institutionalized by the modern university. White supremacy is written into the Sanskritized conceptualization of religion we research and teach. It resonates with histories of colonial collaboration, caste oppression, and Islamophobia. There have been some attempts to challenge structural power in the field of Hindu studies. As many AAR members may know, Hindu studies has long been a contested terrain. One development was the founding in 2002 of DANAM, the Dharma Academy of North America. This conference runs alongside the AAR, and as Shanna Sippi has written, was meant initially to be a space in which scholar practitioners of the quote-unquote dharmic traditions could find a voice. In practice, it has come to offer a program that is indistinguishable from papers offered in other units of the AAR. Arun Kumar Chaudhry has shown how another ongoing issue has been the public challenge of the legitimacy of Hindu studies scholars by extreme right-wing conservative Hindus. More recently at the AAR, we have seen the ongoing presence and participation of the Hindu American Foundation, an organization that includes liberal and conservative Hindus who are united in a desire to take ownership of the narrative of Hinduism in public discourse. That is, brown bodies are allowed to speak for Hinduism. Sylvia would call all these kinds of groups Hindu-centric activists in the academy, or HINCA is what she says, HINCAA. They seek to recenter Hindus as the subject and producers of Hindu studies. HINCA groups represent a range of political perspectives and allegiances. Some directly challenge the right of white scholars to do the research they do, while others support white scholars as long as they do not challenge their own understandings of tradition. Some of the most prominent voices in this group are white converts. While diverging around tactics and politics, HINCA groups have in common a desire to claim a space for Hindus as practitioners in scholarship and in public life. But these strategies do not critique the structural power of white supremacy, nor do they critique the structural power, particularly among caste-based Hindus, that is, Savarna Hindus. In trying to defend Hinduism, Hinkas claim to speak for all Hindus in a deeply problematic and homogenizing way. Hinka neo-revivalism too easily reproduces the dangerous dynamics of nationalism, caste, Islamophobia, and anti-Blackness. Hinka activists and Hindu-centric scholars are unwilling to hear from dissenting voices: feminist, anti-racist, anti-national, anti-caste, anti-capitalist, because critique from within the community is contrary to their agenda. The desire to project a universalizing identity is really a desire for access to supremacy in all its whiteness. There have been several high-profile cases and conflicts in which Hinka scholars have challenged white scholars in their works. Typically, these boil down to Hindu chauvinist attacks against left-leaning, well-meaning, and even feminist white academics. Sylvia doesn't rehash all of the examples here, but anyone who is familiar with the field can recall examples of this even in this past year. These attacks, particularly in the era of social media, often involve misogynist language and threats of harm. Conservative Hinka activists lash out against researchers who they feel have misrepresented or maligned Hinduism. When this happens, progressive Hindu academics have no choice but to reaffirm their alliance with WISCs, that is the white casteist Hindu studies, and defend the intellectual tradition. Is there a way that we can break out of these dynamics, Sylvia asks. There is a third formation that Sylvia would like to describe that she calls SIFHIS. She actually purposely titled this as sci-fis. She told me that she wanted the acronym to sound like that. So scholars of intersectional feminist Hindu studies. Sylvia would locate herself in this group along with a number of colleagues with whom she has been talking about these issues and whose ideas have helped her to shape her thoughts here. And this is in relation to a panel that Sylvia and I and Trina Gandhi, who is here, who are part of, that will discuss this very issue tomorrow morning. Sci-fi scholars are scholars whose work is informed by critical race and transnational feminist theory. We are racialized scholars in white institutions. We do diversity work, we do emotional labor and mentoring with students of color and colleagues. We support our racialized communities, and we also study Hinduism. We are aware that we really don't belong in WISCs. We fear that if we look or sound critical of WISCs scholarship, or if we react to experiences of racism that is tied to our Hindu identities or racialized bodies, we risk being read as Hinkas. So we are working towards centering ourselves as racialized scholars with sometimes complicated relationships with Hindu identity. Crucially, we want to do this in a way that meaningfully critiques whiteness, casteism, Islamophobia, and anti-Blackness in our communities and in the academy. We resist Hinka positions and tactics, and we see that there are many other voices advocating for critiques of Hindu supremacy that are drowned out by them. We are advocating for an approach to Hindu studies that actively resists universalizing and aligns itself with social justice. As scholars of color in Hindu studies, questions of method, of objectivity, of outmoded perceptions of insider perspectives plagues us. When a white scholar is part of the community that they research, say, sits on the temple board, lives in a village in India, that is laudable. When we are part of communities, it is immediately assumed by all sides that we are practically members of the VHP, that is a Hindu nationalist organization. Our ability to think critically as scholars is questioned. For those among us who identify as Hindus, we are often also torn in a push and pull between our scholarly commitments and family pressures to represent the community. There are other complex issues about identity and authority that are raised: gender presentation, caste names, shadism, that mediate our experiences in fieldwork in ways that we must have space to consider. Sylvia invites you, that is you all in this room, to sit with these observations and consider what this generates for you. She does not wish to suggest that white scholars should not study Hinduism. Many of these are scholars who have done really important work in the field, whose work has shaped her own thinking and certainly my own. But the objective of this writing, and she thinks the objective of Dr. Chaudhry's essay that has prompted, is to ask, how does power work in the academy? What are our intentions? Sylvia ends her paper by suggesting that WISC scholars, even the most thoughtful liberal white scholars, and even those who are themselves racialized, are failing their non-white students and colleagues when they do not acknowledge and challenge the ways that they are complicit with the racism that is part of our institutions. We all need to interrogate how our whiteness is reproduced in our institutions, our departments, our citational practices, and our classrooms, and start thinking about making spaces for scholars of color, even when that means having to relinquish some power. We are asking for accountability. We must mean more to you than intellectual curiosity. You don't get to work on our bodies and our histories without also enacting an ethics of care towards racialized people, students, colleagues. In Silage's utopian vision, there is no racism or systemic oppression. University is free and accessible, and we all live happily ever after. But since that likely won't ever happen in our lifetimes, the next best thing we can do is call upon our white colleagues and mentors to show up and be allies in meaningful ways so we can transform our institutions, our fields, our practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our second speaker is Dr. Andrea White, who received her PhD from the University of Chicago and is Associate Professor of Theology and Culture at the Union Theological Seminary, specializing in constructive Christian theology, especially womanist theology and postmodern religious thought. She is a recipient of the Lilly Theological Research Faculty Fellowship from the Association of Theological Schools and the Louisville Institute Book Grant for Minority Scholars. She is the author of the forthcoming monographs, The Scandal of the Flesh, Black Women's Bodies and God Politics, and The Back of God, A Theology of Otherness in Karl Barth and Paul Ricoeur, and is the editor of a forthcoming volume, Feminist and Womanist Theologies. Dr. White?
Thank you. Thank you, Rumi, for the introduction, and also Ayesha for the honor to be here to engage your work and to be with all of you. I've been thinking about this since it was published, and I remember the day that you approached me and shared with me that there were many, 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 many hits and a controversial uproar about this piece. So it's very exciting to finally be able to engage it. I wish to take up the issue of contortion that Dr. Chaudhry raises in her article. She writes, "Since the terms, the rules of engagement, are set by white supremacist Islamic studies, Muslim scholars of color have no choice but to contort themselves out of shape to play the game. But playing the game like this on these terms that demand we decenter ourselves and write as if we do not care about our subject matter, when the only reason we are here is because we care deeply, means that even if we get to play the game, we can never win, which is to say, we always lose." Contortion is an apt metaphor for navigating the identity politics of knowledge production in womanist theology. In the 2006 publication of Deeper Shades of Purple, edited by Stacey Floyd Thomas, womanist scholars recount story after story of their experiences of dehumanizing disregard in the academy. Katie Cannon's opening essay is entitled "Structured Academic Amnesia, as if this true womanist story never happened." By contortion, I mean the work of perceiving when scholarship is being disregarded and when it is being tokenized, instrumentalized, ghettoized, or commodified. Historically, Black women in the academy are routinely dismissed as intellectually inferior, but at some point, womanist work became a politically correct mark of the myth that progressive liberal thinking had been achieved in the academy. Students soon wanted to jump on the Black women-only train. White male students in my classes would ask, "Can I be a womanist?" Some students wouldn't ask at all and would declare womanist identity for themselves, taking a comfy seat in the snack car. Who can be a womanist is a fascinating question because of its accompanying implicit question of whose interests are being served in proclaiming womanist identity. Some womanist scholars contend that being a descendant of slavocracy in the United States is prerequisite for claiming womanist identity. Others will contend that there is a shared experience for women of color globally considered. This, of course, runs into the wearying debate about the risk of presuming monolithic group identity the very moment a single word is breathed. The linguistic predicament entails that discourse can only ever be essentializing and therefore only ever violent. We might do well to consider what Judith Butler identifies as the mistake of locating the problem of difference as that which emerges between one identity and another. Instead, difference is the condition of possibility of identity, or rather, its constitutive limit. What makes its articulation possible is at the same time what makes any final or closed articulation impossible. And I have in mind here Michelle Wright's Physics of Blackness. There are as many womanist scholars of religion as there are positions on whether womanism is a method, a movement, or an identity. And in the spirit of the via negativa, womanism is not a feeling, it is not a badge of honor worn for street cred, it is not an academic marketing device, it is not about competing oppressions. It is, at the very least, an academic discipline with a body of scholarly literature. It at least means reading and citing Black women's books. The issue of contortion also calls to mind Monica Coleman's well-known essay, Must I Be Womanist?, published in the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion in 2006. She refers poignantly to the commodification and commercialization of the term womanist within the academic study of religion. Paraphrasing her somewhat, she writes, "The assumption is that all Black women in the academic study of religion are womanists. Sadly enough, it is almost a marketable necessity. This fact became clear. If I wanted to get a job, I had better identify as a womanist and do it quickly. The term womanist may now be larger than the women who initially claimed it. Can womanists reclaim the term? Do they even want to? Is this commercialization a sign of advancement? Or have hierarchical entities co-opted it as yet another way to brand and classify Black women and our thoughts? If this is the case, womanism has not had the revolutionary effect of its Black feminist roots. Perhaps the realistic need for job security tempers the fire of the revolution." That's Monica Coleman. In addition to the issue of commodification, womanist theology must contend with the preconception that it functions as either soft theology or not theology at all. When theologians ask, what is womanist theology, the query might very possibly be a reproach in disguise. It betrays a certain skepticism about what counts as theological. In its more nuanced form, the question about its qualifications as a theological enterprise implies that the study of African American women's religious experience does not immediately present itself as a theological project. African American women's religious experience is the subject matter of maybe critical race theory, maybe anthropology, sociology, religious history, but not theology. My work in womanist thought rests on the premise that womanist theology is indeed theological, not because it is a special case, not because we must stretch or distort the parameters of the theological canon, but because it is theological in a most paradigmatic sense. For one, womanist theology treats race, class, and gender oppression as particularly theological problems. Womanist theology is recognized largely for its contributions to atonement theory with its productive critiques against redemptive suffering. Its insights have challenged conceptions of servanthood, the valuation of submissiveness, surrogacy, the valuation of standing in for others rather than for oneself, and sacrifice, the valuation of suffering. Servanthood, surrogacy, and sacrifice all glorify Black women's subordination based on deeply embedded and divinely sanctioned views of Black female bodies. But even more fundamentally, in the tradition of Western Christian thought, race and religion are co-constitutive. The work of Willie James Jennings and Kelly Brown Douglas make the case. And Kil Andajar also helps my case here when he writes, "Blood operates, or shall we say circulates, at the outer extremes of politics, there where the shedding of blood signifies sovereignty and the ultimate exercise of power, as well as the undoing of the community that descends into violence. Blood is a political concept that irrigates a particular conception of politics. In the Christian West, blood is politics, and politics is blood. Our political hematology, a political hemophilia, our politics are drenched in blood, the love of blood. I want to say that within the context of Union Theological Seminary, where I teach the birthplace of Black and womanist theology, political as a qualifier of theology is just another way of saying theological theology. Political theology is a tautological expression that describes and prescribes what theology always and already is. If theology is political, then it is also ideology critique. And depending on how you tell the story, the task of Christian theology was determined long ago by Eusebius and the ideological link between Christianity and social power. If historical persistence, since at least Eusebius, is a marker of banality, then the story of religion and politics, race and religion, is the most banal. It is its persistent banality that preoccupies me, the insidious normalization of violence that demands a theological response. Womanist theology is, I contend, a theology of otherness. Jean-Luc Marion claims that racism and genocide are the logical consequence of weak arguments for the other. Analogy, empathy, language are, he says, probable arguments for another flesh. And while such arguments might be enough to support the presumption of the other, they never manifest the other straight on. Above all, they do not provide resistance to violent denials of flesh. Racism and the global killing it logically implies exploits the weakness of these arguments for another flesh. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our third speaker is Dr. Sylvia Chan Malik, who received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and is Associate Professor of American Studies and Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. Dr. Chan Malik's scholarship examines the intersections of race, gender, and religion, and how these categories interact in struggles for social justice. Her work brings together the fields of American Studies, critical race and ethnic studies, and women's and gender studies, and among her many publications is her recent monograph titled Being Muslim, A Cultural History of Women of Color and American Islam. Dr. Chan Malik?
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Ayesha, for inviting me to engage this really generative and groundbreaking work, which I'll talk about how I come to that adjective for this essay in a minute. I wanted to start by saying, as with so many panels that we go on, they asked us to have our remarks ready in advance, which is a nice thought, which many of us aspire to, and you know, in good faith say we will absolutely do. So I started off, you know, so I was asked to make these remarks, and I said, okay, of course I can do it. So I read the essay, and I was just absolutely kind of floored by the essay itself. And then I put it down, and I started thinking about what to say, and then, you know, a month passed, and it wasn't because of the essay, it was because of me. And so all of this is a way to say, my response begins not just by saying that I'm, you know, a serial procrastinator and, you know, all that stuff that academics are, but honestly, as I reflected on what was keeping me from sitting down and composing the remarks, I really came to understand that I knew when I read it that this was a game-changing, path-breaking scholarly intervention. I mean, I could just feel it. You can read that when you engage work like that. It comes through in the words, it jumps off the pages. But I think my hesitation in constructing my remarks was really about the fact that it was intervening upon a field that I do not call my own, right? And that is the field of Islamic studies. And so I want to think a little bit about that and try to connect it to the fields I work out of and try to draw some similarities and parallels between my own kind of engagements with these concepts that Dr. Chaudhry puts forth in her essay, and try to find some energy and synergy between these different disciplinary places that we all come from. So Islamic Studies is a field that I am still learning and familiarizing myself with, one in which I am a bit of an interloper, and one in which I am learning, as with any field, has robust debates and varied approaches amongst its practitioners, which have accrued over time not only to address evolving modes of scholarly inquiry, but also as genealogies of shifting registers of power and notions of epistemological difference among its practitioners. As someone who was trained in literary and cultural studies at the height of the culture wars in the United States in the 1990s, who received a PhD in ethnic studies and currently teaches in interdisciplinary departments of American and women's and gender studies, notions of power and difference are and always have been at the heart of everything I do. It's kind of ground zero. Right? And so to put it in the words of Stuart Hall, I am always concerned about fatal couplings of power and difference. Recently, I wrote a book about American Muslim women, and more specifically, Black Muslim women, in which I approach my subject and archive through the racial, gendered, class, and regional hierarchies that Muslim women have occupied in the US across the last century. It's from this vantage point, as someone who comes from this position of always looking at power and difference, and I don't even know how to not be attuned. I don't know what it means to do neutral scholarship. Does anyone still say they do neutral scholarship? I don't know. That would be silly. And it's from this vantage point that I investigated how these differentials manifested in the identities, the affective practices, religious expressions, built environments, conceptions of struggle, desires for liberation, definitions of freedom, and notions of religion and spirituality in the lives of American Muslim women, both Black and non-Black, as well as looking at the political and cultural circumstances that shaped and influenced US Muslim women's identities at varying moments in time. It's also from this vantage point, this critical ethnic studies vantage point, that I've come to engage the fields of Islamic studies and religious studies. And it's been a really illuminating and at times confounding process, which has required me to rethink and scrutinize my own left, or these kind of progressive biases that I have in my fields, and receive knowledges around concepts of tradition, religion, secularism, feminism, activism, Christianity, Marxism and materialist analysis, gender and gender roles, what is liberal, what is conservative, and how to understand struggles for justice in both secular and sacred spaces. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about ethnic studies for those of you who might be familiar, but for those of you who are not. Ethnic studies, the field in which I received my graduate training, is an interdisciplinary endeavor whose origins are rooted in the Third World liberation struggles of the 1960s and 70s in the US beyond. It was established in places like UC Berkeley, which is my alma mater, and San Francisco State in order to decolonize the university, and you see how this relates to Dr. Chaudhry's work, through producing insurgent scholarship that centered the epistemologies and histories of people of color. There are many intersections between ethnic studies and the fields I currently teach in, American Studies and Women's and Gender Studies, the former, American Studies, due to the critical turn that took place in the 1990s in that field that centered empire and imperialism as central to the very idea of America, and the latter, Women's and Gender Studies, in regard to how issues of gender and sexuality are inseparable from analyses of race, class, and nation, right? So intersectional analysis. I began my own research into US Muslim women in a post-9/11 moment in which there were few existing portrayals of Islam and Muslims in the US, period. In the years following 9/11, I watched as work after work emerged in my chosen fields and in progressive discourse and politics more broadly that seemed only to characterize Muslims as victims and objects of state violence through rubrics of surveillance, military occupation, racial and religious profiling, etc. For me, this seemed to replicate Orientalist logics, just from a different political orientation, from the left instead of the right. And thus, a necessary intervention into this discourse was an examination of the actual role of religion, religious identity, and faith practices in US Muslim women's lives. This included an exploration of how such factors had shaped modes of political agency and resistance in relation to the political, cultural, and social contexts of race, gender, class, and sexuality at different moments in time. And since the vast majority of Muslim women in the US prior to the 1960s were African American, I immersed myself in investigating the religious lives of Black Muslim women. It was very hard to find their presence in the archives. Thus, my foray into Islamic studies and religious studies in large part began and was most fully realized in my examination of Black women's modes of engaging Islamic theology, of how they theologized, of Black women's lived experiences of Islam in the US, and how they produced Islamic modes of living and expressing themselves as Muslims in a place where there was little to no precedent for such an identity. Thus, when I read Dr. Chaudhry's cutting insights, and I hope I pronounce these acronyms correctly, WISIS, PILS, and IIS, yes, good, yay, on the ways in which racial and gendered epistemologies, how racial and gendered hierarchies have formed the foundations of Islamic studies, the sustained effects of how these foundations of how scholarship is produced and circulated, and how scholars like her are confronting these white supremacist and patriarchal underpinnings, as well as the ways in which these racist and sexist ideologies persist across the field, I felt a deep and abiding sense of recognition. WISIS, Dr. Chaudhry writes, quote, designates pre-colonial and medieval texts as the real Islam. So this is truth, right? And identifies mastery of Arabic as central to its practice and decenters Muslims in actual Muslim voices and subjectivities in the field. In PILS, Patriarchal Islamic Studies, quote, a small male elite dictates a patriarchal version of Islam which stresses masculinist forms of religiosity and maintains a discourse of male supremacy by ignoring, erasing, and silencing Muslim women's voices unless they conform to the PILS worldview. To put it another way, to quote James Baldwin, for women, a PILS worldview, so for a woman to want to be taken seriously, to adapt this worldview is, quote, the price of the ticket. So as I was, and it was so cool that you pointed out, like, there's no citations or anything, because even in just responding and trying to think what I was going to say today, it occurred to me, it just kind of hit me that it reminded me so much of an essay that influenced me so deeply in my own development, and has completely shaped me as a scholar. And this is Barbara Christian's 1998 essay, The Race for Theory. And I don't know how many people are familiar with this essay, but Barbara Christian was an African-American feminist literary scholar at UC Berkeley, amazing, groundbreaking scholar. And in 1988, she wrote this very short essay, 14 pages, I just looked it up on JSTOR, called The Race for Theory. And just like Dr. Chaudhry's essay, no citations, one citation. Audre Lorde, she cites at the end. There's one footnote, right? And in this essay, what Dr. Christian does is she talks about how, while she is engaging in the field of literary studies, these new critics and new philosophers and new historians in this moment, she feels a sense of kind of sickness and repugnance, because even as these new critics are trying to come up with this new way of engaging the canon, she once again sees how they are completely kind of relegating voices and perspectives like her to the sidelines. And so I just want to read a little bit of Christian's voice and put that into the conversation here, because she really captures the way in which she, as a woman of color, as a Black woman from the West Indies, engaging a Eurocentric literary canon, her experience of that and what that feels like. So here she goes talking about what it feels like when she hears certain terms. For I feel that the new emphasis on literary critical theory is as hegemonic as the world it attacks. I see the language it creates as one that mystifies rather than clarifies our condition, making it possible for a few people who know that particular language to control the critical scene. That language, interestingly, surfaced just when the literature of people of color, Black women, Latin Americans, and Africans began to move into the center. Such words as center and periphery, so this very language that we use to do our scholarship, are themselves instructive. Discourse, canon, texts, words as Latinate as the tradition from which they come are quite familiar to me. And this is Barbara Christian speaking of her own upbringing. Because I went to a Catholic mission school in the West Indies, I must confess that I cannot hear the word canon without smelling incense, that the word text immediately brings back agonizing memories of biblical exegesis, that discourse reeks for me of metaphysics forced down my throat in those courses that trace world philosophy from Aristotle through Aquinas to Heidegger. Periphery, too, is a word I heard throughout my childhood, for if anything was seen as being the periphery, it was those small Caribbean islands that had neither landmass nor military power. Still, I noted how intensely important this periphery was, for US troops were continually invading one island or another if any change in political control ever seemed to be occurring. As I lived among folk for whom language was an absolutely necessary way of validating our existence, I was told that the minds of the world lived only in the small continent of Europe. And I absolutely love that passage because Christian is talking about the ways in which she, as a black woman from the West Indies, now working in the Western Academy in the United States, has an entirely different experience of these terms that she is now supposed to deploy as part of her scholarly practice. She has a whole effective register in which she understands these terms that are completely different from many of her peers. And that matters, right? And I think one of the questions that we're trying to deal with is how do we acknowledge those different affective registers in which we experience the terms of engagement in our fields. I want to turn now, and I'm going to close up by talking about the ways in which I think about the ways that Muslim women have engaged Islam at different moments in time. And one concept that I use in my book to think about is this notion of affective insurgency. That at different moments in time, African American Muslim and Muslim women more broadly in the United States have had to engage Islam as a non-white, non-Christian religion, and thus had to construct their religious identities through categories of race and gender and class against the dominant logics of the time. And so this is something that they had to feel in their bodies and that they had to express with intent, right, and with agency against different political and cultural circumstances. And so this againstness, I argue, is a central tenet of what US Muslims women's identities are premised upon. And so it seems to me that Dr. Chaudhry's work enacts the very type of againstness that I argue Black Muslim women engaged in their desire to produce Islamic identities in the US. In order to do so, Black Muslim women rejected religious doctrines of Christianity, their devaluation in US society and culture, and produced their own forms of belonging. They cleared out their own spaces against ignorance and hostility rooted in racism and misogyny. Yet by engaging the field of Islamic studies, Chaudhry turns to the work of Black women and women of color via the work of Kimberly Crenshaw and other Black and women of color feminists through her adoption of the term intersectional Islamic studies to reflect the intersecting subjectivities that must converge to create robust scholarship that actually captures the complexity of Muslim lives. It is my sincere hope, even as an interloper, that Chaudhry's intervention is taken up roundly in Islamic studies and beyond. At the same time, I hope for more robust analysis of religion and religious practice, and in particular, Islam, in my own fields of ethnic, American, and women's and gender studies that go beyond victimhood and consider the full complexity of Muslim lives in the US and beyond. To put it another way, I find Dr. Chaudhry's essay to open up exciting, discursive, and practical terrains of interaction and possibility between both of our respective fields and many others, and for this, I am immensely grateful. I want to end with another quote from Dr. Barbara Christian, which I think really speaks to what I think this work is doing and saying and how we should engage it from wherever we are. And speaking of literary criticism, she's speaking of literary criticism, but I'm going to adapt it to Islamic Studies. Christian writes, "For whom are we doing what we are doing when we do," she says literary criticism, but I'm going to say, "For whom are we doing what we are doing when we do Islamic Studies?" It is, I think, the central question today, especially for the few of us who have infiltrated the academy, and she's speaking of women of color at that time, infiltrated the academy enough to be wooed by it. The answer to that question determines what orientation we take in our work, the language we use, the purposes for which it is intended. I can only speak for myself, but what I write and how I write is done in order to save my own life. And I mean that literally. For me, my work is a way of knowing that I am not hallucinating, that whatever I feel and know is. It is an affirmation that sensuality is intelligence, that sensual language is language that makes sense. So I'd like to close by saying thank you to Dr. Chaudhry for opening a space of affirmation in Islamic studies for those who have heretofore found themselves stifled, silenced. Thank you for opening a space in which an emerging generation of scholars, of activists, of community members, of Muslims may find the voices needed to save their, and in turn, all of our lives. Because as Black and women of color feminists have always told us, struggle is shared, freedom is collective, and we're not there until all of us are free.
Thank you very much. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Simranjeet Singh, who received his PhD from Columbia University and is this year's Luce ACLS Fellow for Religion, Journalism, and International Affairs. He's also a visiting scholar at the Center for Religion and Media and Senior Religion Fellow for the Sikh Coalition at New York University, where he serves as the university's Sikh chaplain. A winner of the Walter Wink Scholar Activist Award, Dr. Singh is a regular commentator for national news outlets and is a columnist for the Religion News Service. Dr. Singh.
Thank you. I'm going to take a cue from Ayesha here and choose not to perform our traditional forms of scholarship that we're critiquing. I'll center myself as a scholar of color and lean into a little bit of my own personal experience to illustrate some of the points that Ayesha makes in her paper. The first job interview I had was still ABD, campus visit, meet with the university president, and the first thing he says to me after our greetings is, "Oh, interesting, I see you're a Sikh. How could you possibly teach Islamic studies?" And aside from illustrating that he didn't know what we do as scholars of religion, he performed exactly what Ayesha describes in her paper, in that, in his understanding, whiteness is normative and non-whiteness is deviant. It's to be explained, it's to be justified, right? And in that moment, I couldn't point out to him that the Christian scholars were practicing Christians in that same department, the Jewish scholars were practicing Jews. I couldn't say that, right? I had to respond in a way that contorted. I had to fit his expectation, and I hated myself for it. I got the job. I love myself for that. But it was an extreme position of vulnerability, right, in which that situation, that dynamic of power was enacted. And I had no power in that moment. And so what's going on here? I think just as we see in the forms of implicit bias, these kinds of power structures are not going to be reckoned with by those who hold the power, in part because they would not want to give it up, but also in part because of what Ayesha describes in her paper, that for those who have power and privilege, those are usually our blind spots, right? We don't usually see the privileges that we enjoy because we're not thinking about them. We're thinking about our struggles, right, and overcoming those struggles. Those things in the academy, I think, are changing a bit now because I see folks like Ayesha asking these questions and pushing these conversations. And that, that's why she called me. She knows my politics. She knew I would agree with everything she said in the article, and I do. And so yes to the intersectional approach, yes to rejecting the neocolonialist models, rejecting white supremacy, patriarchy. Yes to overcoming the facade of objectivity and to analyzing the subjectivities of those who made our fields. Yes to centering the people whose traditions we study. For me personally, and this is just a reflection on how I felt reading the piece itself, it was one of the most refreshing, honest, delightful pieces I've read in scholarship in a long time. And for that, I'm grateful to Ayesha for writing it and for sharing it, because I know that doing work like this comes with a lot of risk and vulnerability. Part of the task for me on this panel is to reflect on how this fits within the broader field of Sikh studies. And I would simply say that the three buckets you identify here are absolutely apt, right? The WISIS, the PILs, the IIS. The common frame that we often use, or at least I have been exposed to in the field of Sikh studies, is the traditional scholarship, which is code for brown people who are trained in Punjab and often writing in Punjabi, and the Western scholarship, those who have been trained in colonial, post-colonial, neo-colonial institutions. The traditional scholars are not respected in our field typically because of power, because of how we understand training, because of what we think about their agendas or their biases or their intention to have some sort of impact on the community that they're a part of. These Sikh writers are often dismissed as being apologetic, right? They care too much. And these two categories I found problematic for a lot of reasons. I mean, the most obvious of which is I don't fit into either of those. I'm a brown man who was born and raised in the US and trained at Ivy League institutions, right? That's who I am, and I'm both, but I'm neither. And so it also fails to account for people's actual methodologies, approaches, intentions, objectives, their subjectivities, right? And so it's not actually that helpful. There is already an immense gap between these two communities in our field, in Sikh studies, where there's very little interaction or conversation between the traditional and the Western scholars. And so, in other words, what I'm saying is it doesn't really matter if you're Western trained or not, as our current model presumes. What matters is it matters if you perform the Western or the WISIS approach. And we all do. That's what we're trained to do. That's what I have been doing up until relatively recently. And one of the interesting aspects of my own experience that Ayesha's paper helps name and expose is that there is an emergence of intersectional approached scholars who center their own lived experiences, who care about their communities, and are actually politically engaged and see their scholarship as political work. And what that has meant for me in the field of Sikh studies, and it's a small field, is that there doesn't seem to be much place for me. I don't fit into these groupings, and I don't find interest in performing within these groupings to indicate for folks how to categorize me. And I know many in our small, discrete field and in the larger academy, in the larger field of religious studies, look down on my work or judge me for the political work I do. I work for a civil rights advocacy organization. I've been on staff with them for 6 years. I do public scholarship. I write for news outlets. I'm on the board for the Religion News Association. I write columns. All of these sorts of things really indicate what my politics are and that I see my scholarship as public political work. And don't even get me started on other aspects of my work, like the children's book I'm working on, or interfaith engagement. Right? These are not to be discussed in scholarly circles. And people in our field are worried, and I know this because they've expressed it to me. They're worried that I'm overly political, and they worry that my political agenda compromises the objectivity of my scholarship. And I'm worried that these same people believe in objectivity. Right? This is the conversation we're having. I'm also worried that they don't feel any responsibility to use their scholarship, the privilege of knowledge, for moral good, right? And this is a call out that Ayesha makes in her paper. And it leaves me asking the question, do scholars who pursue objectivity actually care about the people that they study? That's my question. So this is just a general reflection on the field in relation to Ayesha's paper. There's one question that came to my mind as I was reading the piece, and I bring it up to Ayesha. I'm sure she's already thought of this, and I'd just like to hear her reaction to it. But I'm a little surprised that Christianity doesn't feature more prominently in the piece. From my vantage point, it's not just about a lens through which others are seen. There's also power dynamics at work here that produce other kinds of supremacies and marginalization. And I know this has been much discussed, particularly in relation to Islamic studies and how the field of Islamic studies has been produced and conditioned. It hasn't been as much a conversation in Sikh studies, and so this is a selfish interest of mine. This is something that I'm working on. And so I'm just raising it for that reason. I'll just offer a simple example from the project that I'm working on that illustrates what this has meant in the context of Sikh studies. The last person to do a monograph on Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism, wrote his book 50 years ago. And the man who wrote it, MacLeod, was a former Presbyterian missionary who had been trained in biblical studies. And he made immense contributions to the field. Of course, the father of Sikh studies, right? Father, of course. And much of his work, of course, was colored by his training, right? He brought biblical criticism into his reading of early accounts of Guru Nanak's life. He placed and categorized Guru Nanak's biographies as hagiographies. He understood him as a saint, right? These very Western Christian categories. And in doing that, he created a context in which we came to understand Guru Nanak in a very particular way. And part of that was his understanding was very different than what early sources show, and also what any Sikh on the street would say, right? So essentially, this scholarship presented Guru Nanak as an apolitical spiritual figure who had no interest in politics, social life, or organized religion. And that is contrary to what every Sikh is taught growing up, contrary to what all the early sources tell us, right? And contrary to the very text that he was studying at the time. And so the question that I've been asking myself in this book project is, well, how is it possible that he comes to this conclusion? And I've been struggling with that until I read your piece, and it is the only way that's possible is if you decenter these people because you don't trust them as reliable sources. Not just the people who are living that in their reality, but also the people who are producing these texts. And the way that this gets perpetuated is as scholars are training over time under MacLeod, they are then reproducing this same knowledge base until it becomes a presentation of fact and accepted as reality. So anyway, this is how religious supremacy and Christianity in particular has played a role in producing the same sort of power structure in shaping the field of Sikh studies. And so I'd be very interested to hear the question. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what it might look like if you had talked about Christianity more in your paper, and also if you had thought about it, why you chose not to address it. So, thank you.
Thank you. Our fifth speaker is the author of the article, Islamic Legal Studies, A Critical Historiography, Dr. Ayesha S. Chaudhry, who received her PhD from New York University and is Associate Professor of Gender and Islam and the Canada Research Chair in Religion, Law, and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Chaudhry is the author of Domestic Violence in the Islamic Tradition, Ethics, Law, and the Muslim Discourse on Gender, and she is also a fellow of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation and a member of the Royal Society of Canada. Dr. Chaudhry?
Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking the ALHR for hosting this amazing session and to Rumi Ahmed for organizing us together today and working out logistical details at the last second. Thank you very much. And I want to thank all of you for being here today. It's a real blessing to listen to and learn from such brilliant scholars as are on this panel, who are also formidable human beings and dear friends. And it's not every day that an academic panel feels like joy and blessing and can follow genuine engagement and curiosity. So I want to begin by acknowledging this. Thank you to each of you for your thoughtful engagement with my paper and for sharing your experiences, insights, your struggles, and your wisdom. For my remarks today, I thought I would share the story of how this essay came to be, some of the reactions I have received, and what I'm thinking about as I look ahead. In late 2012, so a very long time ago, I agreed to write an article for the Oxford Handbook on Islamic Law on the historiography of the Quran. Upon agreeing, I received an email outlining the expectations for the article. For consistency, the editors asked authors to organize our chapters in a standard format. They asked us to do four things. Number one, define the question. Number two, offer a history of how scholars in the field have addressed this question. This would form the bulk of the article. Number three, assess the scholarly treatment of the question, reflecting on the success and limitations of the scholarly treatment. And number four, close with a discussion of future areas and topics of study. The expectation was that together, the handbook would shape the direction of future scholarship on Islamic law. The editors also offered us technical advice. Use footnotes, Chicago style for citation and bibliography, write for a broad audience, even considering readers outside of the university, and keep transliteration to a minimum. When I agreed to write this article, I believe the editors and I had a shared understanding that I would be writing a standard historiography with a little bit of an Ayesha twist. First, I would write the historiography of the Quran as anyone might write it, whether me or a non-Muslim male or a white female scholar. In sections 3 and 4, I might offer original analysis and perhaps hint at a bold path forward. My suggestions might raise some eyebrows, but I would not say anything too dramatic or radical. After all, everyone knows that historiographies are not the ideal venue for creative and fresh thinking. In the historiography section, I was expected to, and I expected myself to, tell the standard story of the study of the Quran in the Western Academy. Name the white male giants of the field. Be super progressive and count a few white women among their ranks. If I really wanted to push boundaries, I could sprinkle some color into the mix. Consider texts that are not strictly canonical, but gesture that we might consider them to be part of our canon. A subtle and delicate, gentle even, challenge to the canon. Without, of course, actually contesting the canon outright. This is, after all, the Oxford Handbook on Islamic Law. It is a respectable enterprise. I had to act the part of a respectable scholar now that I had been honored with an invitation to contribute to this esteemed project. When I agreed to write this article, I was excited to be invited, and I was fine with writing it like this. Until this point in my career, I had done exactly what was expected of me. My survival in this field depended on it. I had upheld my end of the bargain, followed the rules, even as I observed the rules applied unevenly, unfairly, subjectively, with discretion, which is to say, without accountability. And then, over the next years, I tried to write this article. I stared at the blank page on my computer screen with the title of the article and the handbook and my name at the top in 3 lines. I made a list of scholars I better make sure to reference, better not forget anyone important and look stupid and unprepared. Can you believe she didn't reference so-and-so? What an oversight. Apparently, anyone can get a PhD if they're brown. Must be a diversity thing. In 2015-16, I found myself at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard for a year-long fellowship, and one of my basic goals for the year was to write this article. How perfect, I thought. I could finally devote my time and attention to this project, and all the books I would need to reference were at Harvard. I wouldn't have to ILL everything. I went into the catalog and ordered all the books, article after article, book after book, edited volume after edited volume, by scholars whose names were mostly not Muslim, mostly white, mostly male. I sat in my beautiful office that fall, the light pouring in through the large window, reading, turning pages, restless, anxious, angry, frustrated, and bored. Really, really bored. To prevent myself from curling into a ball and taking a nap in the patch of sunlight as I moved from my office floor to my desk, I photocopied pages of articles and books I thought I had to reference. So I stood at the photocopier in Byerly Hall, using my unlimited copying privileges to photocopy what was considered the canon of my field. A canon I felt deeply ambivalent about, a canon that bored me, that failed to capture my imagination. As if to bring my ambivalence into sharp relief, a white male colleague of mine, a professor at Brown University, stopped by and asked me for compelling arguments he might offer his teenage son over family dinner to help him see that Islam was not an inherently violent religion. There was nothing in the pages that I was photocopying to help me respond to this violent request that demanded that I defend the humanity of Muslims. In fact, some of the pages I was photocopying would reaffirm this child's view of Islam and Muslims as inherently violent. Unwilling to do the emotional labor required to assert the humanity of Muslims, I encouraged this fellow to educate himself so he would not ask racist and Islamophobic questions of me. I mean, why are these questions not asked of Jews or Christians or Americans or white people, all of whom have a history of genocidal practices? No one is special. This paper was becoming more and more difficult to write. I wanted to write it less and less. Just get it over with, I coached myself. Just write the damn thing. Who cares how you feel about this? This isn't about your feelings. When the unkind and berating voice failed, I asked it to chill for a second and instead tried to listen, like really listen to myself for a change. Why don't you want to write this paper, dear? I asked myself kindly. And then I listened closely. Because stories are powerful. The stories we tell about ourselves and each other, they shape us. They influence our present, our imaginations, and our futures. I am just now returning from a difficult trip to Spain where I confronted racism and Islamophobia in a particularly acute form, especially at the few remaining historic sites built by Muslims, before the Christians expelled and murdered and destroyed Muslims and other religious communities in Spain, before the 300-year Inquisition, during which the Spanish also unleashed destruction upon Turtle Island and on Africans through the enslavement and trafficking of humans in barbaric conditions. These sites came to feel to me like borders with security and guards, most of whom wanted to prevent me from entering the sites, despite the fact that I had official documentation, the correct tickets, passes, etc. These uniformed officers were unkind, some were outright rude. One threatened to call the police on me when I sat down for a moment in the Mosque of Cordoba, where Al-Qurtubi might have sat and meditated and thought his thoughts. My experiences at these sites as a Muslim trying to connect to the Muslim past in these physical spaces and being either denied access or allowed extremely restricted access felt familiar. It was like my experience in graduate school. The fact that these sites felt like border crossings confused me at first. But then I realized these sites are a kind of a border. They offer entrance into a particular narrative of the past, and the gatekeepers were trying their best to limit my access because they knew that, as a Muslim, I would have a different relationship to this history than they were telling. The stories we tell about the past matter, and the stories we tell about the stories matter too. The stories that we tell and the stories about our stories are expressions of power, privileging certain narratives while suppressing others, leaving them to be forgotten or to languish in obscurity. I knew the story I was expected to tell about Quranic studies in the Western Academy, but I did not believe it, I did not agree with it, I had real problems with it. The normative story covered truths, erased sins, it forgot monstrosities, it did violence, it justified violence. So I did not want to write it yet again, perpetuating it, giving it my stamp of approval, which as a person of color and as a Muslim who knew better, also felt like betrayal. It was complicity against myself. So then I asked myself, is there a story you would like to tell instead? And the answer was simple, yes. I wanted to tell the story not of Quranic studies, but of Islamic studies, and not just in the West, but also in the world. I wanted to tell the story the way I saw it, understood it, experienced it. After all, what's the point of everyone writing more or less the same story in a historiography? Why retell a story if you have nothing to add? In this way, historiographical writing can feel like ritual, like the national anthem, or the Pledge of Allegiance, or like prayer. It is there to remind us, to constrain the imagination, to channel it in a particular direction. It is not meant to offer alternatives. Historiographies are not about dreaming new futures so much as they are about codifying the past, hardening it into a single narrative with a set number of heroes and deities, paying homage to the founders, the gods of the field. They are about indoctrination. I have a proven track record of being indoctrinated poorly. Whether this is a character flaw or a strength, I do not know. I do know that it has caused me a great deal of grief. The standard story of my field failed to capture my imagination because I knew it to be false, so I found myself writing a different story. Over the fall of 2016, I gave myself time to think about the story I wanted to write. I walked and walked and walked and talked about the ideas I was playing with. Finally, in December of 2016, well after the fellowship year and well after I had agreed to write this paper, I was seized to write the story of the history of Islamic studies. The story poured out of me in full sentences and paragraphs and sections, threw my pen onto paper, literally. I was writing with a pen and paper, in cafes in Sydney, sticky with the summer heat. I had been thinking about the story all my life, but especially for the last 2 decades, so when I finally started writing, the writing spilled out of me, almost fully formed. The writing felt electric and cathartic and good. It felt cleansing and freeing and like I was finally telling the truth. It was purifying. I'd say it took about 3 weeks for the paper to be born. I returned to a wintry and icy January in Vancouver and set about transcribing what I had written at my kitchen table, typing up the essay. That is when the terror hit me. I perspired through layers of clothing even though it was chilly in the apartment. What if the editors of the handbook did not want to publish this essay? I was certain that I would find another venue to publish it, but I really wanted it to be published in the Oxford handbook to signal a shift in the field. But the editor's reputation would be on the line if they published this paper. They would have to answer for it, and they had not asked for this. So it would be understandable if they did not want to publish the paper, even though the thought of this hurt my feelings. And what if they agreed to publish it? This thought made me sick to my stomach. What if they didn't stand in my way? What would this story cost me? Who would I be making enemies out of? It's funny how terrifying it can be to tell our truth when it diverges from the status quo. All my life, people have told me to speak up, to stand up for myself, to tell my truth. And they have supported me until I speak a truth they do not appreciate. Then they look away, avert eye contact, tell me I'm spoiled and entitled, and I should be silent more often. Be respectful and courteous and civil. Fix your tone and form for fix my tone and form of my speech. Maybe show a bit of gratitude for what we've done for you. We let you in, for God's sake. Since we're here, we know that when I finally turned in my paper, 5 years after I agreed to write it, double the maximum length and without any footnotes, Chicago style or otherwise, the editors courageously decided to publish it in the handbook. They took a risk. They used their privilege to create space for a different kind of scholarship, and I am grateful to them for it. The electronic version of the paper has been out for about a year now, and the handbook has just been published in hard copy. The paper has been viewed over 2,000 times, and the responses have been varied. For the most part, I have received overwhelmingly positive messages from women of color, men of color, from a few white men and women. People described being moved by the paper, relieved to see their experience reflected in academic writing, appreciative for this narrative that rings true for them, and grateful for the space it has created for them. People have described crying reading the paper, glad to hear truths that are usually unspoken and even forbidden. Some people have appreciated some parts of the paper and found other parts challenging. That's a word I have heard several white women use to describe their experience of the essay. Others, unsurprisingly, have hated the paper, mocked it, derided it, some of them today, considered it angry, unsuitable for undergraduates despite the accessible writing style, bemoaned the identity politics it engages in, as if whiteness and maleness are not identities too. One woman described it as, I'm not gonna read that. Interestingly, some people have assumed, in some cases correctly and in other cases incorrectly, that specific lines in the paper were about them personally and have written to explain why I am mischaracterizing them. In this way, the paper has become a kind of mirror, asking readers to examine where they stand, where they see themselves. According to the Pulitzer Prize winner, Gregory Pardlow, Lacan's mirror stage is the moment when the infant recognizes its face in the mirror and realizes something has gone terribly wrong. Until that point, the infant believes she is in union with all consciousness, end quote. The paper works as a mirror of sorts, but in reverse to Lacan's mirror stage. The reader cannot dislodge themselves from the paper, seeing themselves as part of something they would rather stand apart from. We don't always like what we see in mirrors, and sometimes we deal with the image we see with rejection rather than compassion. One of the things I say in the paper is that those with privilege need to use their privilege to lose it. That is to say, they must use it to lose it. And as I dream of a different future for Islamic studies, my dream is, of course, a world in which Islamic studies is intersectional, moral, responsible, ethical, where people of color, and especially women of color, are no longer marginalized and discriminated against, and then gaslit when we finally screw up the courage to speak out loud of our experiences, to describe how we experience the world and how we are treated in this world. But for this to happen, white supremacist Islamic studies and patriarchal Islamic studies must be dismantled. There has to be structural change. Another word for structural change is revolution. The people with power have to agree to less, and they have to convince each other to have less. But power does not dismantle itself easily. It resists its loss. Usually, to maintain itself, it reconfigures itself to co-opt the language of those it discriminates against, those it marginalizes and erases and dominates. It co-opts their language of resistance to maintain its own supremacy. Think here about equity and diversity offices in universities. As Melinda Smith and her colleagues have demonstrated in their work, despite investing more and more resources into the creation of equity and diversity offices over the last several decades, universities have overall failed to increase racial diversity. And whereas they have failed to bring greater racial diversity, they have been highly successful in bringing greater gender and sexual diversity among whites. That is to say, universities have used the language of equity and diversity to diversify their white demographics, effectively entrenching white supremacy, while making grand overtures to their commitment to diversity through equity and diversity offices. All of this to say that power co-opts the language of resistance to justify its continued domination. If we are to have any hope of truly ushering in an intersectional and morally accountable future, those with institutional power must work not only to use the language of equity and diversity, but to divest from their power in a way that makes it impossible to perpetuate. In the university, this means white men, white women, and men of color in faculty and administrative positions must create conditions in which their own power is undermined. This is a difficult proposition on its own, and it must be accompanied by the question, how do we divest from privilege in a way that undermines both white supremacy and patriarchy at the same time? We have too often seen how divestment from patriarchy reinstantiates white supremacy and the other way around. A divestment from white supremacy might bolster patriarchy. So as we imagine new futures, I invite everyone in this room to think on their own institutional complicity in white supremacy and patriarchy, and think about ways to divest from these oppressive structures. To start us off, here are just a few questions we might ask ourselves to gauge our own complicity and to discover the power we have to change the institutions in which we work. Have you ever contributed to an edited volume in which the majority of contributors were white and or male, primarily white and or male? Have you ever sat on a panel that was mostly white or male? Do your syllabi include text primarily by white and or male scholars? How do you create space to challenge the canon in your field? If you serve in an editorial role for a journal or book series, how do you cultivate scholars of color, particularly women and non-binary people of color? Do you cultivate space for scholarship that challenges inherited standards of excellence, even if this means challenging your own scholarship? What do your graduate students look like? Do you have students of color? What kind of scholarship and writing do you cultivate in your students? How do you support your students of color and faculty of color in your department and university? Do you do more so that they can do less? How do you challenge white supremacy and patriarchy on job searches and promotion and tenure decisions? Do you do this even at the expense of your own comfort? What are the ways in which you replicate white supremacy and patriarchy, and how are you trying to change and resist your complicity in these oppressive structures? In other words, how are you using your power to lose your power? And for those of us without institutional power, I invite you to ask this: how does my writing serve to bolster colonial, racist, and patriarchal enterprises that characterize the fields we find ourselves in? How do the standards of excellence that we perpetuate serve to undermine the causes of equity and moral accountability? By centering these questions and keeping them in the foreground of our work, we might be able to create new ways of thinking, new standards of excellence, new ways of writing, and new solutions that we so desperately need today.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our panel for bringing up these, for their wonderful papers. And we are running right up against the time, as this was a 90-minute session. But we do have the room for another 30 minutes amongst ourselves. And since it's very rare for us to be together like this, I would invite the panel to continue the conversation on their own. And I would ask that we please thank the panelists once again. Thank you.